Okinawa, April 1945. Dawn seeped gray into the limestone heights when the first growl reached the cave. Humid air clung to skin. The rock walls sweated. Powder smoke and mildew salted the tongue. Crouched behind a firing slit, a Japanese grenadier steadied his Type 99 and listened. It was not the chatter of a Nambu, nor the distant thud of naval guns, but a slow, deliberate engine note idling closer, as if something armored were breathing. A crisp hiss cut the air, valves opening, and a sheet of liquid fire struck the tunnel mouth. Heat rolled low like a storm. Oxygen thinned. A corporal would later recall that the darkness turned orange at the edges and the ceiling began to drip. Men clawed for air as the blast crawled along the limestone, licking past corners they had thought were safe. Outside, the source hunched in the mud, an M4A3R3 flamethrower Sherman, nicknamed Zippo. Its 75mm gun replaced by a projector of the POA CWS-H1 line. With the E45 system, thickened fuel could be thrown well over 100 yards, in practice often 120-150, clinging to stone, timber, canvas, and cloth. The commander fired in tight 1-second pulses, conserving the load as arcs of flame curled into crevices and vent shafts. Minutes later, interior timbers flashed. Grenades cooked off. The cave that promised invulnerability became a furnace. By afternoon, word crawled through neighboring galleries. Even stone had failed. If fire could bend like water and reach uphill, what defense remained for caves and tunnels? Among the shaken survivors, a quieter question formed. How had the Americans taught a tank to breathe fire? The trail to that answer began years earlier in small, patient trials on distant Pacific outposts. And that is where our story turns next. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific War had turned into a brutal arithmetic of blood and coral. Each new island seized demanded a heavier toll than the last. At Tarawa, Marines waded through surf thick with bodies, discovering that the Japanese did not defend beaches. They defended islands from beneath them. Coral ridges and volcanic slopes were carved into tunnels, machine gun nests, and honeycombed redoubts invisible to reconnaissance aircraft. Shells from battleships the size of cities pounded the atolls for days, yet when the smoke cleared, defenders emerged untouched, crawling from apertures that seemed to breathe fire and lead. General Holland M. Smith, watching men vanish into those mazes, called them burrowed fortresses. The phrase would become a grim prophecy for every island that followed. On Bougainville and Peleliu, the enemy's pattern was clear. They no longer charged in suicidal banzai assaults, but lay buried, waiting. A Marine could clear a pillbox with grenades and phosphorus only to be shot from behind by a soldier who had tunneled through the rock. Inside those humid corridors, voices echoed through ventilation shafts. Japanese troops could vanish between chambers like ghosts. Satchel charges and rifle grenades could destroy an entrance, but never the defenders inside. Even flamethrower teams, carrying the M1 and later the M2 portable models, fought against physics itself. Their arcs of fire barely spanned 20 meters, and the operators were walking targets, men dragging 70 pounds of volatile fuel on their backs. Reports from Tarawa told of Japanese soldiers screaming "Bakayaro," madmen, as they watched Marines advance engulfed in their own reflected firelight. The Bureau of Ordnance knew that no amount of bravery could substitute for reach and protection. To clear the Pacific's stone fortresses, the United States needed a weapon that could crawl forward under armor, breathe flame without exposing flesh, and survive counterattack. Engineers began to imagine a hybrid beast, a tank that carried fire as its main armament. The concept was not born from theory, but from necessity, and the crucible of the Pacific would soon turn that necessity into invention. In the first months of 1944, amid the volcanic ridges and cane fields of Oahu, a handful of engineers from the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service and the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, were engaged in work so secret that even neighboring units could not guess its purpose. The island's air was thick with salt and diesel as welders stripped turrets from battle-worn M3 and M4 Shermans, replacing the 75mm cannon with something entirely new, a steel snout designed not to fire shells, but to exhale flame. This experimental machine, formerly labeled the POA-CWS-H1, short for Pacific Ocean Area Chemical Warfare Service Hawaii No. 1, was unlike anything the Pacific Theater had seen. Where the barrel once stood, a pipe of seamless alloy, connected to a pressure-fed reservoir holding a mixture of gasoline thickened with an aluminum soap compound that would later evolve into Napalm B. When ignited and forced out by compressed nitrogen, it formed a stream of burning gel that clung to rock, steel, and skin alike, reaching distances of 120 to 150 yards. The fuel burned at over 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to strip oxygen from cave interiors and melt jungle undergrowth into blackened glass. Inside the tank, the crew endured both awe and fear. Protective baffles and asbestos-lined panels were fitted to guard against heat blowback. Pressure tanks were nested deep behind armored bulkheads so that even a direct hit would not trigger a catastrophic detonation. The M4A3 variant soon became the most successful, carrying about 400 gallons of fuel, enough for 80 to 100 short bursts, each lasting 3 seconds, each capable of clearing a cave that had resisted weeks of bombardment. Marines, half-joking, nicknamed it the Zippo, after the lighters that had become their trademark in foxholes. On Oahu's black slopes, trials left nothing but scorched craters where bunkers once stood. Observers noted that the flame's roar was followed by an uncanny silence. The jungle simply ceased to exist in its path. By midsummer, the first operational batch, Under Chemical Warfare Service Detachment 2, was sealed aboard landing ships bound for Iwo Jima. Their presence was officially unacknowledged, their mission unspoken. Within weeks, these armored infernos would land on beaches of volcanic ash and change forever how the United States fought for the Pacific when the first waves of U.S. Marines stormed the black beaches of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. They faced not a line of defenders, but an island that had become a weapon. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's 21,000 men were buried inside a labyrinth of tunnels stretching more than 16 kilometers beneath the volcanic rock, connecting pillboxes, artillery chambers, and command posts. The surface seemed deserted until it erupted. Mortar rounds burst from invisible vents, machine guns flared from slits no wider than a fist, and flamethrower teams advancing on foot found themselves smothered in return fire. The M2 backpack flamethrowers that had burned through jungles on Tarawa and Peleliu sputtered uselessly against the sealed mouths of subterranean fortresses. By the 6th day of battle, the Marines of the 5th Division rolled out their new answer. On February 26th, the first M4A3R3 Zippo tanks were unleashed at the foot of Mount Suribachi. Their approach was slow, deliberate, the black sand collapsing under their treads, but once in range, the world before them seemed to ignite. Streams of viscous flame roared from the projector, hissing into tunnel mouths and embrasures. The mixture clung to walls, ricocheted down shafts, and devoured every breathable pocket of air. Inside, Japanese soldiers faced temperatures that reached hundreds of degrees in seconds. Ammunition stocks cooked off in chain detonations that shook the ground. Diaries recovered later spoke of a sun inside the cave, of walls that melted and fell like wax. The psychological collapse was immediate. Soldiers who once sneered at American cowardice for fighting from afar now broke from cover at the mere sight of the fire tanks. But each Zippo was a magnet for death. Enemy guns zeroed in on their fuel compartments, and refueling demanded Marines to stand exposed with hoses and cans under sniper fire. Even so, within 72 hours, flame tanks had neutralized dozens of positions that no shell or bomb had touched. When the smoke over Suribachi thinned, Marines stared into tunnels still glowing red. The victory carried a cost, an odor of burned oil and flesh that no man would forget. Yet among the commanders, a cold clarity took hold. If the Zippo could break Iwo Jima, it would be indispensable for the storm to come. Okinawa. By April 1945, the invasion of Okinawa began under a sky that seemed to tremble with the sound of warships. It was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, when 300 ships, 180,000 troops, and the grim awareness that this would be the last great stepping stone before Japan itself. Across the island, 120,000 Japanese troops of the 32nd Army, commanded by General Mitsuru Ushijima, had turned Okinawa's limestone hills into fortresses. Beneath the surface stretched miles of interlocking caves and galleries, linked by tunnels invisible from the air. Artillery and airstrikes pounded the ridges day and night, yet when the barrages stopped, the enemy guns reawakened as if the earth itself were firing back. Into this inferno came the 713th Flame Tank Battalion, its 54 M4A3R3 Zippos parceled among Army and Marine units along the front. The crews had learned from Iwo Jima that victory would come not from speed but from method. The new doctrine was simple, brutal, and efficient. Tanks advanced to within 30 yards of a cave mouth, unleashed a 3-second torrent of fire, and reversed as infantry surged forward through the rolling heat. The technique turned war into a terrible choreography: flame, withdrawal, advance, silence. The thickened fuel pooled into tunnels, crawled along ceilings, and consumed the oxygen that defenders needed to live. At first, Japanese soldiers mocked the machines, calling them metal turtles for their slow, rounded silhouettes. But derision turned to dread when those turtles exhaled flame that reached deep into the limestone. Diaries found after the battle spoke of air that turned to fire and of men clawing the rock in suffocation. By May, as the ancient stones of Shuri Castle collapsed under bombardment, Japanese officers reported entire companies vanishing in flame. Even the most hardened among them began to whisper that the Americans had harnessed a weapon born from hell itself. When the guns finally fell silent, the hills of Okinawa still smoked for days. U.S. planners studying the island's ruins saw a terrible precedent. On the Japanese home islands, where the cave defenses multiplied tenfold, the Zippo was no longer just a weapon. It was an omen of what invasion would mean. Among the debris-strewn slopes of Okinawa, intelligence officers leafed through what remained of Japanese diaries, pages brittle with humidity and soot. The entries spoke not of honor or strategy, but of fear. One infantryman scrawled, "Even the bravest cannot face the fire beast. We pray for quick death." Such words were unthinkable under imperial doctrine, where surrender was shame and death was a duty. Yet the flamethrower tanks, those roaring, smoke-breathing monsters, had carved through more than rock. They had cracked the soul of the Imperial Army. In Tokyo, analysts at the Imperial General Headquarters examined these reports with growing unease. Phrases like psychological collapse of confined defenders appeared in their summaries, clinical words to describe men reduced to terror by heat and smoke. Propaganda ministries tried to stem the dread, describing the Zippo tanks as cowardly machines hiding behind armor, but even officers who repeated the slogans could not mask their own revulsion when the wind carried the stench of burned fuel and flesh from Okinawa's southern caves. Veterans later admitted that just the distant growl of a Sherman engine sent tremors through their ranks. Fire had replaced artillery as the language of fear. Desperation drove innovation of the most brutal kind. Japanese engineers devised crude traps, hoping to detonate flame tanks with mines buried in coral. Infantry units trained for suicidal ambushes, clutching satchel charges or strapping explosives to their bodies as human mines. Few reached their targets. Mud, narrow ridgelines, and the armored bulk of the Shermans made escape impossible once detected. A sergeant who survived the campaign recalled, "You could hear them coming, clanking, growling, and then the air turned into liquid fire." American intelligence intercepted these morale reports and studied them closely. To commanders, the data confirmed what the battlefield already showed. Flame had achieved what bombardment could not. It broke the will to fight. By summer's end, long before Hiroshima, some officers quietly believed that if the invasion of Japan came, it would not be the atom but fire that would end the war. Behind the terrifying spectacle of the flamethrower tank lay an equally remarkable story of logistics and engineering ingenuity. In the final months of 1944, the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, already stretched by the demands of global war, created a network of secret conversion depots across the Pacific. The largest operated in Hawaii and Saipan, where rows of standard M4A3 Shermans were stripped, retooled, and reborn as flame tanks. Each transformation demanded roughly 200 man-hours of meticulous labor and nearly 1,800 pounds of new fittings, high-pressure hoses, nitrogen cylinders, reinforced armor baffles, and precision-engineered nozzles. The Ronson and Navy Mark I flamethrower systems were the heart of these machines. Compact, efficient, and adaptable to battlefield repair. The Navy's Seabees, masters of improvisation, performed on-site modifications wherever the tanks landed. They fabricated mounting brackets from scrap steel, rewired ignition systems, and tested fuel lines under conditions that often bordered on chaos. Thousands of miles away in Chicago's Continental Machine Company, production lines hummed around the clock to churn out replacement fuel tanks, valves, and nozzle assemblies. Every piece had to withstand not just pressure but flame itself, enduring heat that could liquefy ordinary metals. To keep the Zippos alive, an entire sub-fleet of supply vessels evolved, nicknamed flame tenders. These ships carried thousands of barrels of napalm thickened gasoline, nitrogen tanks, and spare parts across waters still patrolled by submarines. A single M4A3R3 in combat could consume up to 1,000 gallons of fuel a day, forcing logisticians to choreograph a near-continuous relay of resupply. Remarkably, despite the volatility of their cargo, no tender was ever lost to accident or enemy fire. It was a triumph of wartime precision and discipline. By June 1945, over 150 operational flamethrower tanks were deployed across the Pacific Islands, from Iwo Jima to Luzon, forming what soldiers informally called the Zippo network, with production stabilized and refueling seamless. American planners began to look toward the final chapter, Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself, where fire would again lead the way. By mid-1945, the flamethrower tank had evolved from an experimental curiosity into a doctrinal weapon, one that redefined how the U.S. military fought across the Pacific. Before its arrival, every assault on a fortified island required days of naval bombardment, followed by costly infantry charges into cave mouths and bunkers that refused to die. But once the Zippos entered battle, commanders began crafting operations around their capabilities. Instead of pulverizing terrain with artillery, they used precision fire to suffocate resistance. Reports from Okinawa's 10th Army Command showed a startling pattern. Units supported by flame tanks suffered nearly 30% fewer infantry casualties compared to those without. In some sectors, entire cave complexes surrendered moments after the first jet of fire swept their entrances. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, commanding U.S. forces on Okinawa until his death in June 1945, noted in his field journal that flame has become the spearhead of progress. His words reflected more than admiration. They marked a shift in military thinking. Fire had ceased to be a mere weapon. It had become a tactical philosophy. Where artillery flattened, flame purified. The Zippo tanks turned the battlefield into a science of heat and pressure, reducing the need for prolonged siege and forcing enemy morale to collapse faster than positions could be mapped. The Japanese tried to adapt. Engineers dug flame trenches, cut vent shafts, and camouflaged cave mouths, but the gelled fuel's adhesion and penetration rendered such defenses futile. American troops, initially appalled by the horror of the weapon, grew resigned to its necessity. Chaplains wrote conflicted sermons about fire as judgment, preaching hope in the morning and blessing flame tanks by evening. Strategically, the Zippo validated a harsh truth. No level of fanaticism could outlast technology engineered for total destruction. In Washington, as the Joint Chiefs met in July 1945 to finalize plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Kyushu, the new doctrine was clear. Every assault wave would be preceded not by shellfire alone, but by flame. For the men who crewed the M4A3R3 flamethrower tanks, victory carried a smell they could never forget. They described it as the scent of war itself, a mixture of burning soil, rubber, and flesh that clung to uniforms long after battle. Inside the steel hull, heat built until sweat streamed down their arms and pooled beneath their boots. The Zippo was both protection and punishment, a machine that shielded its crew with armor, even as it forced them to witness the most horrific kind of death. Each refueling brought its own peril. A spark, a misgrounded cable, even the static from a wool sleeve could ignite the 400 gallons of volatile napalm mix sloshing within. Maintenance crews worked in near silence, knowing one mistake would leave nothing but smoke. Medical officers began to notice the toll. Some operators flinched at the hiss of steam or avoided food for days after missions. A few were treated for what wartime physicians called battle fatigue, though modern terms would name it trauma. One Marine mechanic later recalled how the tank gunners, after a successful mission, sat apart from others in the mess, their faces blank. They had seen what fire did in confined spaces, the instant silencing of screams, the caves glowing like furnaces. On the Japanese side, captured survivors told of the same nightmare from the other end. Prisoners averted their eyes from daylight, whispering of endless fire and the sound of walls melting. Interrogators noted tremors, burns inflicted not by contact, but by sheer heat exposure. Yet among the American ranks, moral hesitation was rare. To the infantrymen who followed behind the Zippos, each burst of flame meant fewer friends gutted in ambushes or dragged into tunnels. The weapon was horror, but it saved lives. By June 1945, as Okinawa fell silent under rain and ash, the surviving crews of the 713th Battalion returned to Guam. Their tanks were blackened with soot, their eyes hollow from reflection. And yet, as orders filtered in, they knew rest would be brief. If Japan refused surrender, these same men and their machines of fire would soon be the first to land on its shores. July 1945 found planners in Washington rehearsing the unthinkable, a two-part invasion codenamed Operation Downfall, with Olympic aimed at Kyushu and Coronet destined for Honshu. War Department briefs allocated more than 500 flamethrower tanks to the first landings, and engineers drew up blueprints for specialized flame groups that paired Zippos with demolition teams, bulldozers to clear rubble, and engineers tasked with sealing and ventilating captured caves. Intelligence warned of an estimated 5,000 fortified tunnels on the home islands, some fitted with steel blast doors and articulated, air ducts designed to baffle incendiaries, so the chemical warfare service pushed further development. Nozzles capable of longer jets, prototypes reaching as far as 180 yards in tests, and fuel formulations pressurized to ignite even in humid coastal atmospheres. Training units practiced house-to-house and cave-clearing drills on Tinian and Saipan, simulating civilian evacuation corridors and rehearsing tight coordination between armor, infantry, and engineers. Logistics officers updated routing plans to place fuel depots within assault ranges and to embed flame tenders in convoy schedules. At the same time, legal officers, chaplains, and senior politicians debated the moral and diplomatic fallout of deploying mechanized fire against densely populated shoreline defenses. Leaflets and psychological operations were drafted to warn civilians of fire rain and encourage evacuation, an effort to mitigate casualties even as preparations hardened. Then, in August, the course of those plans was overtaken by events. The atomic strikes and Emperor Hirohito's August 15th announcement obviated the invasion. The flamethrower battalions remained staged across Pacific anchorages, their engines silent. Yet their presence had already reshaped military thought, teaching planners that mechanized flame could be decisive, and would ripple into post-war doctrine and the bitter debates about means, ends, and the limits of technological force. Historians would later argue those lessons shaped occupation-era tactics and legal debates. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the flamethrower Shermans were among the first weapons to disappear from the headlines. Their hulks sat in depots from Guam to Saipan, engines drained, waiting for orders that never came. Within a year, most were dismantled or melted down. Only a handful were retained for training. The American public saw almost nothing of them, few photographs, no newsreel footage, because the weapon's imagery clashed with the triumphal narrative of liberation and rebuilding. Yet in military circles, analysts quietly continued to study what the Zippos had accomplished. A 1946 report by the U.S. Army's Pacific Warfare Board described Flamethrower tanks as the single most decisive instrument against fortified positions, crediting them with breaching defenses that had resisted weeks of shelling. Their legacy refused to die with the war. Engineers in the early Cold War revived the concept for Korea, adapting flamethrowers to armored personnel carriers like the M67 Zippo Patton. In Vietnam, helicopters such as the UH-1 Frog carried flame pods born from the same Pacific research. Meanwhile, Japanese officers testifying at post-war tribunals referred to the terror flame, providing some of the first official documentation of psychological warfare as a measurable factor in combat effectiveness. Among Japan's veterans, silence became a form of survival. Only decades later did historians uncover private diaries describing dreams of burning tunnels and the smell of molten rock. In the United States, the story of the flamethrower tank shrank to a few technical paragraphs in ordnance manuals. Pressures, flow rates, ignition voltages stripped of human context. But in the rusting carcasses preserved in Pacific museums, the memory lingers. Scorched paint still bears fingerprints of men who once harnessed fire not as myth, but as method. They, and those who faced them, carried its shadow long after the war had ended. When the guns fell silent after Okinawa, the Pacific seemed to breathe again. Waves rolled against the charred cliffs, washing over the scars of battle. But for those who had seen the work of the flamethrower tanks, peace felt fragile, almost unreal. For the Japanese soldiers who had believed stone and spirit could outlast steel, the revelation was unbearable. Even the earth itself could burn. Caves once seen as sanctuaries had turned into tombs of molten air. Their courage had met not merely superior firepower, but a weapon that consumed courage itself. For the Americans, too, the experience left an imprint no metal could erase. Inside their Shermans, Marines learned what it meant to command destruction so complete that it blurred the line between victory and horror. The flame tanks were not just machines. They were mirrors reflecting what modern war had become, science fused with fear. Each burst of liquid fire ended a fight swiftly, yet left behind a moral residue that no debriefing could wash away. In the decades that followed, from Korea's hills to the sands of the Gulf, the legacy of those infernos endured in doctrine and memory. Strategists spoke of shock effect, but veterans remembered the smell. On Okinawa's cliffs, where tunnels still scar the limestone, the air feels faintly warm, as if history itself still smolders. In 1945, humanity learned that the true frontier of warfare was not steel or stone, but flame.